This is a University of Otago podcast.
Cool, and welcome back to the talks, and this is our third talk for today's session. We're hearing from Evan Balkcom on the limits of the potential limits of what science can answer.
Thanks. So, are there limits to the questions that science can answer? If we asked everyone in this room this question, we'd probably get a different answer from each person. And there isn't a fixed answer to this question. There is no specific yes or no here. People don't always agree with science even when there is scientific consensus. What I'm really interested in is science skepticism. So why are people skeptical of science and the scientific process in general? We see this in our day-to-day lives with climate skepticism. There are major controversies over the theory of evolution, things that within science are considered more or less settled. So our first step towards trying to understand the limits that people place on science and why there is so much science skepticism in people's day-to-day lives was to try and find out the types of events that people think science can't explain. So we began by asking this question to 200 undergraduates here at the University of Otago. We asked them to give us an example of an event that science could never adequately explain. A little more than half of the students thought that there were events that science couldn't explain. And based on their responses, we created a system of categories that you see here surrounding the central question. These are big questions, so like inexplicable natural phenomena, things that we would think of as within the realm of science. Hidden forces or powers. I think I'm having some mic difficulty. Hidden forces or powers, which are sort of things that operate in opposition to natural laws as they're understood. Of course, we've got religious events on there, which are things known about either through authoritative religious texts or divine intervention, divine action in modern life. Death-related phenomena, which are things that imply the survival of a spiritual self, ghosts, near-death experiences, this sort of thing. Qualia, which are inner first-person experiences. Love, emotion, deja vu, the nature of consciousness, these sorts of things. All of these came out in reasonably significant numbers in the responses we got. We also posed this question to a little more than 1,000 people in the United States using Amazon's Mechanical Turk platform. And these are the things, this is the breakdown of the responses by category. What's most interesting about this is that big questions are the largest category. They're more than double the size of any other category. This holds true even when the participants are split by religiosity. In fact, religious participants gave us a result where big questions were even larger than they are in this model. So these are some of the questions. These are some things that came up over and over and over among the big questions category. Things like the origin of the universe and the origin of life on Earth, these are sort of understandably vague questions. Science has some pretty compelling answers to these questions already, but it's still open to interpretation. Interestingly, though, some of these other things that multiple people gave us as responses are things that science clearly already has answered. So why people only use 10% of their brains appeared more than 5 times. But that, as I'm sure everyone here knows, is an urban legend. People use almost all of their brains almost all the time. So what causes the wind? Also something that science clearly has an answer for. Wind is, I'm no expert on wind, but more or less wind is the result of differing atmospheric pressures, rotating of the planet, and differential heating at the poles and the equator kind of cause these atmospheric differences leading to the wind. But there are several people in our sample, and I'm sure even more in the general population, that view these questions as unexplainable, that view this realm of information as outside of the scope of science. It's possible, and an intuitive explanation for this is that it's simply a knowledge deficit. It's possible that these people just don't know that this information is out there, they don't have access to it. If they only knew what scientists knew, everyone would agree. And that is possible, and that is the most intuitive and often the sort of most advanced explanation, or the one that's most often advanced, I should say. However, there are some problems with this. 2012 study found that increased scientific literacy, even specific literacy related to the climate among non-scientist members of the public, led to lower levels of climate change concern. Part of this effect may be due to the fact that these people are insulated a bit from the more alarmist climate change, the more alarmist sort of climate models. However, it's still a disturbing effect because their level of climate change concern was still significantly lower than the level of climate change concern within the scientific community. Clearly, knowledge isn't the answer in that case. Right? Then there's this 1982 work on risk perception, which more or less shows that societal harms are associated very often with transgressions against social norms in people's minds, even when knowledge is controlled for. So if someone violates societal norms, something bad happens to them, even if there is evidence that those two things are completely unrelated, people still tend to relate them in their minds, and this effect seems to be sort of impenetrable to knowledge, because even the knowledge that the things are unrelated does not make the effect go away. And then finally, there's some more recent work showing that social trust outweighs knowledge and acceptance of new technologies. This can be organizational trust, trust for individuals. So if you trust a corporation or a governmental department, you're much more likely to accept a new technology advanced by that group, that individual, that department. Even when knowledge is controlled for, again, so the more you know about these new technologies, you would think the more accepting you would be of them, but that isn't always the case when social trust is sort of turned on its head and you don't have social trust for an organization. So if a bad organization does a very good thing and we know that it's a good thing, there's still this urge to not accept it. Sometimes it overpowers the knowledge. We have a slightly different answer to this question, or we're working on a slightly different answer, and that's that it may be related to the scope of science. So different individuals, different types of individuals, may have different opinions on the types of questions that science can and should answer. Science may compete with other domains for limited explanatory space as well. As you see up here, I've got a sort of separated pie chart with New Age beliefs, science, and religion. And if we imagine all three of those things competing for the same pie graph, you can see as any one of them gains ground, the other two lose ground. Of course, this is not meant to be exactly what happens or anything like that, just an illustration of the potential effect. Preston and Epley in 2009 tested this in regards to science and religion and found that as religion or science gained ground, the other lost ground even in unrelated domains. So acceptance of climate change may decrease acceptance of religious explanations for completely unrelated questions simply because it's affected the scope of science. It's affected a person's viewpoint on science. This may carry with it a motivational factor. So religious individuals or individuals maybe with a scientific outlook might be motivated to maintain that outlook by ignoring sources of information from competing domains. So if you are religious, you may be unwilling to accept scientific explanations, even on questions that religion is completely silent about, simply because it challenges the religious domain in other ways, other areas that may not intuitively seem linked. So we're continuing research on this. We've broken down these participants based on religiosity. We've compared the category sizes with the different groups, and hopefully we'll have a paper on this coming out sometime in the next month or so. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks very much for that. That was really interesting. Does anyone have any questions? Yes.
When you compared, you probably don't need it. When you looked at the students and got their views,
Right.
were they like students? Were they students from across all the kind of faculties?
Well, they were students from the psychology department, the philosophy department, and the religious studies department. So we tried to get a good mix.
And when you compared those responses with the 1,000 responses that you got from the United States, was there did you get a different kind of breakdown?
Well, there were some differences, but among the religious individuals in both samples, here, let me go back to the pie chart. Way back there. Okay, so this basic graph kind of holds true across all the samples, especially the big questions and death-related segments. Ghosts, death-related phenomena are generally considered and research has kind of borne out the fact that they're the most often experienced supernatural event across cultures. So I was kind of surprised that category wasn't larger than it is. But yeah, in general, big questions were the largest, and they all followed this same kind of trend. Now, the numbers of religious and non-religious people differed. The initial breakdown of the yes or no question, are there things that science can't explain? In the sample with the students, only 25% of the non-religious students thought there were questions science couldn't explain, and more than 60% of the religious students thought there were questions science couldn't explain, which certainly makes sense, but we did not expect the natural category to be the largest.
Cool, awesome. So I have a question as well.
Sure.
Back to the Khan et al. Paper. Do you think there's what the causative reason for that is? So knowing more, and you care less about the effects of climate change? Could it be a sense of sort of learned helplessness? Like you know the scope of the problem, so you're just like, I can't do anything about it.
I didn't consider that, but that would make sense because really it is an almost insurmountable issue that we're facing. Inaction is the worst possible response to it, but I guess I could see how inaction would be tempting.
We see this in a lot of animal models with behavior, and that continual negative impact induces a learned helplessness. So they learn not to respond because it's pointless to do anything. So they just.
And that is definitely true and possible. But the paper was more focused on level of concern than action, which it's kind of hard to separate the two. Yeah. And I would imagine they inform each other quite directly, but you would think, or I would think that level of concern should at least have increased, even if it was in a helpless way, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Learned helplessness is a response to a really extreme amount of concern, maybe, or an insurmountable problem that is definitely something that you can't handle. These individuals were less concerned about the effects of climate change in general and the way that it would affect them within their lifetimes, and affect their children and things like that.
Do you think there'd be a correlation between like socioeconomic levels? Like if you're higher scientific literacy is probably, I'm assuming, correlates to sort of higher up the food chain socioeconomically.
Yeah, I think it does normally.
Being higher up the food chain tends to indicate that those people are going to be less impacted by climate change. So
That's
you think
true.
their perception of the impact it's going to have on them as they become more educated, as they're probably climbing the ladder, as it were?
I don't know if they consider that in the paper, but that is a good point. And I think it would probably also be related to, people higher up the food chain engage in more conspicuous consumption, so they're sort of more invested in not being concerned, right? Or at least that's another possible link there.
Awesome. Interesting. Thanks very much.